Today we're going to look at several events that lead to conflicts between the 13 English colonies and the British government. As you can see here, we have a timeline that covers several of these events, starting with the Sugar Act in 1764, the Stamp Act and Quartering Act 1765, the Townshend Acts, the repeal of the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the Coercive Acts. Okay. So we're looking at a time period of 10 years between 1764 and 1774 of conflicts between the 13 colonies and the British government. Things to be able to answer after the end of this. How did the British government hope to end its money problems after the French and Indian War? So again, the British government was having money issues after the French and Indian War. What were their plans to make money for the British government? What was the colonists' reaction to the Stamp Act? So when we're thinking about this question, think about the reaction. Okay, reaction, something has to happen, which was the Stamp Act. How did they deal with the Stamp Act, or what did they do as a result of the Stamp Act? Third question, what did the meeting of the Stamp Act Congress accomplish? So again, this is another result question. You have the Stamp Act Congress. What happened as a result of the Stamp Act Congress? The fourth question, list examples of how colonists organized to protest British taxes in the colonies. Looking for different ways that colonists would organize. Any efforts that they were trying to protest British taxes we are looking for here. Again, there's more than one example of this. You're going to have to go through the whole reading to find examples. We start off with the problems that Great Britain's facing after the French and Indian War. Okay. The big part of the French and Indian War that affected the Native Americans was the fact that all this land was now British territory, and that the Native Americans were not going to be treated as kindly as the French treated the Native Americans. With the British are going to end their trade agreements. They're going to take advantage of the Native Americans, and they're going to try to keep expanding their territory west. Well, the Native Americans are going to then form an alliance led by a Native American chief called Chief Pontiac. Okay. He's going to lead a rebellion called Pontiac's Rebellion that is going to attack British forts in the Ohio Valley region, and also any frontier settlements, any colonists trying to move west. As a result of this, the British, not having much money and not wanting to spend the money to house soldiers in this new territory, issued the Proclamation of 1763. As you can see, this line right here, that my cursor is going over, was a line that the British created saying that no settlers could move west of this line. So you had to live in this part of the 13 colonies. You could not move west and live across the Appalachians in this Ohio Valley region. Okay. This upset many of the colonists and settlers who had already established farms or settlements over here, and they were forced to move back. Also, after the war, the Britain was in debt and expected the colonists to help pay their share of the war. The British felt that the war had cost the colonists very little, and that they should help pay for the British securing this territory for them. So again, they turned to taxing the colonies to solve their money problem. Okay. These new taxes were called acts, and again, they were to raise money for the French and Indian War. The colonists did not like this because they thought the war was not fought for them, but more to protect British trade. The first major act that was passed was the Sugar Act of 1764 that put a tax on molasses and sugar. And that was very key to the colonies because the colonies were in business with this sugar trade from other foreign countries. You have the triangular trade route here where goods were shipped to Africa, then to the Caribbean islands, and then those goods were shipped to the colonies, and a lot of those goods shipped to the colonies from the Caribbean islands were sugar items, sugar goods like molasses and rum. And that was a big part of their trade back to the European countries. Also, the British issued the Quartering Act of 1765, which required the colonists to pay for housing British soldiers here. The British soldiers would stay, or would be required to stay in the cities of the colonies, and the colonists would have to pay for the housing of those men. The colonists protested then when the British passed the Third Act, the Stamp Act of 1765. It was a tax paid on paper and legal documents requiring a stamp that showed that a tax had been paid. This would be things like diplomas, licenses, other legal documents or newspapers, or even playing cards. The British government was for the first time taxing the colonists directly, without the colonial assembly's approval. The colonists felt that this was against their rights, so they cried no taxation without representation. They would also create protests, especially tax collectors. Here's an example of a tax collector being chased by a crowd of protesters. Right? Sometimes they would capture the tax collector, dip them in tar, and put a feather on them, as you see here. Many of the merchants did not like this and refused to buy British goods. This was known as a boycott. The colonists also united to form the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 when they met in New York City. At this Congress, they agreed to send a petition, send a letter to King George III explaining their rights. They declared their rights as British citizens. As a result, in 1766, Britain repealed the Stamp Act, but it wasn't because of their Declaration of Rights at the Stamp Act mainly. It was more because of the boycott that was agreed to by the colonial merchants to not buy British goods. But also, after they repealed the Stamp Act, they also issued the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament had the right to rule and tax the colonies without their approval. Great Britain, again, continued to raise money from the colonists by trying to tax them. The next was the Township Acts of 1767, which placed an import tax of goods coming into the country and allowed the British to obtain search warrants to search property without any reason. This, again, went against what the colonists felt were their rights as British citizens. The tax was on tea, glass, paint, lead, and paper. As a result, more protests occurred. Women started to organize in groups called the Daughters of Liberty and refused to buy British-made cloth and tea, and created spinning clubs where they would weave and knit their own cloth as well as drink herbal teas. Samuel Adams, the leader of the Sons of Liberty, gave speeches, wrote newsletters, and also tried to stir up public anger and spread this hatred of Great Britain throughout the colonies, not just Boston. Tensions increased in 1770 when British soldiers were being harassed by an angry crowd in Boston, and through the confusion fired on the crowd, killing some of the members there. The painting, as you see here, painted by Paul Revere, depicted it as the Boston Massacre. Now these tensions again continued to grow, and the colonists began to organize for independence. Samuel Adams and other Sons of Liberties formed the Committee of Correspondence to spy on the British, to see to watch their troop movements as more British soldiers came in to try to control the protests and uprisings in the colonies. In 1773, the colonists were again angered with the passage of the Tea Act, which lowered the price of tea coming from India. But this angered many colonial merchants who could not sell their colonial tea at the same price. As a result, again, the Sons of Liberty organized and held the Boston Tea Party, where they dumped this tea into the Boston Harbor.